Shortly after midnight on June 6, 1944, a glider passes silently over the Normandy countryside before crash landing in a field close to the Caen canal. On board are the very first Allied troops to arrive in France on D-Day. Their mission is to seize a vital bridge before the Germans can blow it sky high and then hold it at all costs. If they fail, the very fate of the invasion could hang in the balance. This is the story of Pegasus Bridge. Pegasus Bridge was located at the eastern end of the 5 landing beaches on D-Day. It crossed the Caen canal not far from Sword Beach, and the operation that night also involved another bridge half a mile to the east which crossed the river Orne. Taken together, these 2 bridges were so important because they were the only crossing points over these 2 bodies of water close to the coast, and their capture would allow the troops from Sword Beach to link up easily with the 6th Airborne Division, which would be dropping east of the River Orne before dawn. The danger was that if these bridges remained under German control, they would make the perfect route for elements of the 21st Panzer Division to rapidly counterattack into the exits of Sword Beach, potentially throwing the entire eastern side of the landings into chaos. The importance of the 2 bridges, which I'm just going to refer to collectively as Pegasus Bridge from here on to make things easier, was recognised early in the planning stage by the commander of 6th Airborne Division, Major General Richard Gale. Gale asked the 5th Parachute Brigade, the bulk of which would be dropping near the bridges, to send a battalion to secure them as quickly as possible after landing. It was forecast that 7th Battalion could be at the bridges in force by 3 AM on the morning of D-Day, about 2 hours after they were dropped in. But as planning progressed, it soon became clear that this would be far too slow. German plans to destroy the bridges in the event of a landing were picked up by French resistance agents Georges and Thérèse Gondry, who ran a cafe in Benouville right next to the Caen Canal Bridge. If the German troops had 2 hours warning before the first paras showed up there, this would be plenty of time to blow the bridges. Something faster was needed. The solution was utterly daring: to make a company-sized airborne attack directly on the bridge using gliders, in the hopes of overwhelming the defenders so quickly they wouldn't have a chance to push the detonator. Speed and surprise would be absolutely everything, which meant this operation would have to go in some time before the main airborne landings, making the men selected the very first Allied troops to land in Normandy. It was one of the most daring airborne operations ever conceived, and would require remarkable skills and courage from both the infantry and their glider pilots. Also key to the operation's success would be precise timing, which actually ties neatly into the sponsor of today's video, Rec Watches and their Swiss-made watch made from the SR-71 Blackbird. Rec is an independent watch brand from Denmark who make remarkable timepieces infused with materials reclaimed from cars, motorcycles and aircraft of historical significance. Today they've asked me to talk about their really cool limited edition Habu watch, which incorporates titanium that was actually part of an SR-71 Blackbird. The Habu name comes from the nickname that SR-71s had while based in Okinawa, named after a venomous pit viper native to the region. The lower dial of the Habu timepiece integrates authentic SR-71 titanium, sourced from the aircraft's engine exhaust housing. These components were provided by Daniel Freeman, a former chief of metals technology who was directly involved in the SR-71 program. The Habu's design also takes broader inspiration from the SR-71, with a design reminiscent of aviation dials and hands in the shape of the Blackbird silhouette. The Habu is available exclusively at Rec Watches at the link in the description down below, and make sure to use the coupon code Historigraph for an extra 10% off. In early April 1944, D Company from the 2nd Battalion Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry were selected to take part. Their commander, Major John Howard, was briefed on the Pegasus Bridge operation and told to pick 2 other platoons from the battalion to add to his own 4, creating a reinforced company with enough strength to seize the bridges even if a couple of gliders failed to arrive. D Company then began an intensive training program tackling all aspects of bridge assault under Howard's watchful eye. By the time of the operation, Each man would need to know everyone else's job as well as his own. While D Company trained hard, at RAF Tarrant Rushton in Dorset, 12 glider pilots were being put through their own intensive training program, codenamed Deadstick. Deadstick was run by Flight Lieutenant Tommy Grant and was created to deal with the very unique flying challenge posed by the Pegasus Bridge operation. Each glider would, after flying for an hour, need to land at an incredibly precise location at an incredibly precise time. Land too late or too far away, and the bridges could be blown and the entire operation thrown into chaos. To make matters worse, as they would be the very first aircraft to land in Normandy and the need for surprise was total, instead of being released by their tugs at 2,000 feet, the gliders would instead start their descent from 6,000 feet to enable the Halifax tug aircraft to pretend to be a normal bombing raid on Caen. This meant the glider pilots would need to lose 3 times as much altitude as normal while somehow keeping their speed under control and finding their landing zone in the dark. It was the tallest of tall orders. On May 27th, D Company arrived at a camp near Tarrant Rushton, and Major Howard was finally allowed to brief his men on the specifics of the operation. There would be 6 gliders in total, each carrying Major Howard's platoons plus a couple of engineers to disarm the explosives. Howard decided that he would command the assault on the Caen Canal Bridge, while his second-in-command, Captain Brian Priday, would handle matters at the Orne Bridge. The first glider to land was planned to be Staff Sergeant Jim Woolwork's Chalk 91 at Landing Zone X, carrying 25 platoon plus Major Howard and his radio operator Lance Corporal Tappenden. 25 platoon's initial objectives were split into 2. The scout section was to neutralise as fast as they could a pillbox on the eastern bank of the canal that was known to contain the detonator for the explosives on the bridge. The rest of the platoon was to make their way across the bridge and begin to secure the western bank, led by their platoon commander, Lieutenant Denham Brotheridge. In the minutes afterwards, Chalks 92 and 93 would arrive behind the first glider and unload 24 and 14 platoons, which were charged with securing the rest of the eastern bank and reinforcing the western side respectively. At the Orne Bridge, Chalk 94 would land first, containing 22 platoon and D Company second-in-command Captain Brian Priday. They would clear the eastern bank of the Orne before Chalks 95 and 96 would bring 23 platoon and 17 platoon to secure the western bank and reinforce the eastern side. If all went well, the bridges would be secured within minutes and then held against counterattacks until 7th Battalion arrived at 0300. If things didn't go well, then Howard and his officers hoped that their extensive training would give them the ability to improvise on the fly and still get the job done. At 9:30 PM on June 5th, 1944, D Company arrived at Tarrant Rushton, and each platoon began the process of carrying out final checks and being loaded into their respective gliders. An hour later, as the sun disappeared below the horizon, their Halifax bomber tugs began to pull them into position at the end of the runway. And at 10:59 PM, Chalk 91 began its journey down the runway and into the air. The others followed behind at 1-minute intervals, as D Company joined the massive aircraft now in flight above southern England as the largest sea and air invasion force in history headed for France. As D Company made their way across the channel, waiting for them at the bridges were around 50 German troops under the command of Major Hans Schmidt. The defenders were a platoon from 2nd Battalion 736th Grenadier Regiment, a part of the 716th Infantry Division. This was a static division, as was common along the Normandy coast, made up of second-rate troops and non-Germans that had been pressed into service in the Wehrmacht. Significant defences had been erected to defend the 2 bridges, but even though the invasion was clearly imminent at the start of June, Schmidt's platoon were not at full readiness. There were only 2 sentries on duty on each bridge that night, while the rest of the troops dozed in their trenches or in Benouville, while Schmidt himself was over in Ranville. Schmidt had his orders to blow the bridges in case of the invasion beginning, but to avoid the demolition charges being set off prematurely, the explosives weren't even fitted to the bridge. Schmidt expected any attack to come from troops landing by sea, which would give him plenty of notice to seat the charges and blow the bridges. Even as midnight approached and the drone of aircraft began to be audible, this was no cause for alarm. Allied air activity had been a near constant presence over the previous days, and the sentries did not see anything untoward. But 6,000 feet above them, at 6 minutes past midnight on June 6th, the first glider crossed the French coast and was cast off by its tug. The engine noise died away, and Staff Sergeant Woolwork began his descent. His task was immediately made harder by thick cloud, which obscured his view of any landmarks on the ground. This meant he and his co-pilot Ainsworth would have to navigate by dead reckoning. This worked by knowing the aircraft's speed and making precisely timed manoeuvres to end up in the right place. Any tiny error on their behalf could see them wildly off course. After 3 minutes and 42 seconds exactly, Ainsworth exclaimed, "Now," and Woolwork swung the glider around in a wide semicircle, lining up with landing zone X. The glider's altitude was by now just a few hundred feet. Woolwork still couldn't see anything below, but he knew they must be close to the ground. At 14 minutes past midnight, he called back to Major Howard to get his men ready. The glider's side door was opened as its speed came down to below 110 miles an hour. This, by the way, is the actor Richard Todd, playing Major Howard in the 1962 film The Longest Day. Remarkably, Todd himself actually served in the 7th Parachute Battalion during D-Day, and he will turn up at Pegasus Bridge later on in the story. At 16 minutes past midnight, Chalk 91 touched down going just over 90 miles an hour, skidding along the grass before coming to a shuddering halt at the northern edge of the field. Both pilots were thrown out of the aircraft and knocked unconscious by the impact, but when they came round, they would have seen they had landed bang on the money. Chalk 91 had even broken through a layer of barbed wire with its nose, puncturing the first obstacle the paras would need to overcome. It was a remarkable feat of flying. As the pilots lay dazed, behind them Major Howard and his men were pouring out of the glider. The liberation of France had begun. First out was the platoon's Bren light machine gunner, Private Bill Gray, who scampered out of the aircraft, turned and deployed his gun facing the bridge to their north. Platoon commander Lieutenant Brotheridge was right behind him, despite having suffered a broken leg in the impact. Within seconds, Brotheridge was leading his men towards the bridge as the scout section legged it for the demolition bunker just a handful of yards away. 2 German sentries were stood outside the pillbox waiting to be relieved, and hearing the commotion to their south had taken cover behind it. As the scout section approached, one of them fired a red warning flare into the air as 2 others emerged from inside and began to run across the bridge. Private Gray opened fire, cutting the second figure down with a burst of machine gun fire before setting off across the bridge himself. The scout section reached the pillbox seconds later, with Private Wally Parr and Corporal Bill Bailey throwing grenades into the pillbox housing the detonator, while the rest of their section cleared the building next door that contained the machinery to operate the canal bridge. With this done, they reported to Major Howard, who ordered them to get across the bridge as quickly as they could. The Germans were beginning to react to the landings, with sporadic machine gun fire from the north forcing Howard and his radio operator to keep their heads down. On the bridge, the rest of the platoon was facing more opposition as well. Bill Gray spotted a group of Germans moving along the roadside on the western bank and opened fire, hitting one of them. But the Germans began to return fire, and Lieutenant Brotheridge was hit and fell in the road. Parr and Bailey, coming up from the rear, thought the figure lying in the road was another German at first, but soon realised it was their platoon commander. Lieutenant Denham Brotheridge was the first Allied fatality on D-Day. As a now leaderless 25 platoon secured a tenuous hold on the western bank of the canal, back on the east bank the second glider, piloted by Staff Sergeant Oliver Boland, was now coming in fast. At 17 minutes past midnight, exactly a minute after Chalk 91 had touched down, it slammed hard into the ground. Boland swerved to the right to avoid Woolwork's glider, breaking his aircraft back in the process, and it came to a halt some way short of Chalk 91. 24 Platoon's commander, Lieutenant Wood, and others were thrown out of the glider's side door by the impact. As the hawser came to a halt, Sergeant Boland shouted to those still inside, "We're here, piss off and do what you're paid to." With Boland's encouragement ringing in their ears, Wood and his men soon recovered their composure and set about clearing and securing the trenches on the eastern side of the canal. There was some sporadic firing and plenty of grenades chucked into bunkers, but many of those defending this bank thought better of getting into a firefight and have melted away into the darkness. As Wood's platoon got into their task, the third and final glider for the canal bridge, Chalk 93, was coming into land. Faced with a now crowded landing area and carrying more speed than the others, Staff Sergeant Barkway's glider struck the ground and bounced into the air, before crashing hard right on the edge of a marshy pond which had been invisible from the air. The aircraft was wrecked, with platoon commander Lieutenant Smith thrown past the pilots and through the windscreen, seriously damaging his knee. The platoon scrambled to exit the aircraft, but Lance Corporal Greenhow was concussed and fell into the pond in the confusion. Weighed down by heavy equipment on his back, he drowned. Smith's 14 platoon regrouped and moved across the bridge to reinforce 25 platoon, with Smith himself hobbling across as best he could. Shortly afterwards, Lieutenant Wood went to update Major Howard on the progress his platoon was making when a burst of machine gun fire rang out from somewhere in the darkness, catching the lieutenant in the leg. Wood became the third out of 3 platoon commanders to be killed or wounded so far. But regardless, the bridge was in Allied hands, intact. Howard's attention now turned to the east, to the second bridge, where he was hoping to hear that the same had been accomplished. The assault on the bridge over the River Orne had started less well than at the canal. The first glider to arrive, Chalk 94, carrying the company second in command, Captain Brian Priday, encountered navigation problems and got lost. It touched down in a field near Varaville, 8 miles to the east. This made Chalk 95, piloted by Staff Sergeant Pearson, the first to arrive near the Orne Bridge itself, but this glider had a rough approach, losing too much height early on and coming to a halt a long way from the bridge. It would take several minutes of hustling across uneven ground for Lieutenant Sweeney's 23 platoon to reach their objective. This just left Chalk 96, piloted by Staff Sergeant Howard, which managed to make a perfect landing and skid a long way on its belly. When it finally came to a halt, Lieutenant Fox's 17 platoon scampered out and ran for the bridge. They were soon engaged by a machine gun on the far bank, which sprayed inaccurate fire in their general direction. The Allied troops responded with their 2-inch mortar set up by Sergeant Thornton. 2 rounds were fired, landing either side of the eastern end of the bridge and providing some encouragement for the German defenders to retreat from their post. This enabled the platoon to make it across the bridge without further incident, where it was soon joined by Sweeney's platoon. The time was now 26 minutes past midnight, and just 10 minutes after the attacks began, the 2 bridges had been secured. Howard ordered his radio operator, Lance Corporal Ted Tappenden, to start transmitting the code words that indicated success at both bridges: ham and jam. With speed, surprise, and some of the most incredible flying of the entire war, D Company had taken control of the first piece of liberated soil in Western Europe. Now, surrounded by the enemy, they had to hold it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Don't forget to check out the Habu SR-71 Blackbird watch at the link in the description, and use the code Historigraph for 10% off.